Hi, thanks for tuning in. My name is Tom Way, and I'm a senior scientist in the evaluation group at the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance. Of course, that's one of 4 centers that comprise IES. So allow me to kick us off today. So you've most likely heard of SEER by now, but in case not, it stands for Standards for Excellence in Education Research. The SEER was spearheaded by IES's current director, Mark Schneider, and I think it's best described in his own words. And so as you take a look at this quote here, I'll just add a little bit of context by saying that since IES's inception in 2002, much of the focus has been on increasing rigor. And by rigor, we've traditionally meant internal validity or ascertaining cause and effect. And for a while now, we've, I think, had a pretty good handle on that via, for example, IES's What Works clearinghouse system of standards and ratings. But this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Other facets of high quality research are also key to improving not only rigor, but importantly, relevance. And so the point of SEER is really to raise the bar on these other facets. And so the 8 main principles listed here are what comprise SEER. And as you look through these, hopefully they all seem relatively simple and sensible enough. But of course, the devil is in the details. And if we really want to change practice, we'll need to get our hands a little bit dirty and help all researchers execute these standards in the real world with all its inherent messiness. And so over the past few years, IES has partnered with Mathematica and a number of other really smart people in the space to develop a series of quote unquote practice guides. And so today's session really is meant to provide a sneak peek at the first 3 guides in this series. So 2 of the guides that we'll talk about today directly address the SEER principles around open data and generalizability. So first off, we have a primer on ensuring your study can share useful data with the world. Here we're targeting researchers who have had less experience creating a data file for sharing, or perhaps have had not so good experiences in the past with it, and so are a little more hesitant to jump back on the horse. We also include information specific to IES's requirements for PIs around data sharing, although the guide is really meant to be useful for anyone interested in advancing open science principles. Next, we have a comprehensive guide on conducting studies that can generalize to what you actually want to generalize to. And it turns out that this is a pretty tricky thing to do in practice, but our authors have really done an expert job in trying to distill this complexity into 7 key recommendations. Finally, remember that an implicit ultimate objective of SEER is to make research more useful. And so we do that by making it easier to communicate, easier to understand, and just easier to use for practical decision making. And so this is where I think the 3rd guide really tries to make its mark. It addresses a major source of confusion long plaguing empirical studies, and that is of the p-value and statistical significance. In its place, the guide proposes using Bayesian principles to ensure that we're making inferences about questions that policymakers actually want to know the answers to. So rather than fitting neatly into one particular SEER standard, this guide is really meant to be cross-cutting. So these guides are going through IES's peer review process right now, although we expect all the guides to be released within the next few months at the latest. We also understand that the hard work of getting these principles into everyday practice does not stop with the publication of a guide. And therefore, after we release the guides, we do plan to follow up with a host of free technical assistance activities and events, for example, office hours with the authors. I'll also note that we continue to develop new guides covering other SEER standards. For example, one on implementation is currently in the works. So be sure, if you haven't already, to sign up for our news flash to make sure you get all notifications related to the guides. And with that, I'll now turn things over to my very able colleagues who will delve more into each of these 3 forthcoming guides. We look forward to any questions you have after all the presentations are completed, and thanks for your attention.
I'm Ruth Neild from Mathematica. I'm one of the authors of the guide on data sharing that Tom briefly introduced a few moments ago. And I am happy to talk to you about this guide. As an IES research grantee, you are no doubt quite well aware that IES requires some types of studies and centers to make their data available to other investigators when the main research findings are published. IES has required at least 5 cohorts of grantees to share their data in this way as a condition of award. And as we've just heard from Tom, open access to data, findings, and methods is also one of IES's standards for excellence in education research. And there's good reasons for this. The hope is that making study data available to other investigators will facilitate research transparency and accelerate the development of knowledge, useful knowledge, by enabling secondary analysis. But moving on, as we look at the next slide, even for investigators who are fully convinced of the merits of open access to data and are highly motivated to share their data, the practicalities of preparing data files and documentation and deciding where to place the data can feel truly daunting. In fact, it can feel a bit like entering a haunted wood where the path is unclear and unseen dangers may lurk. Making data available for broader use involves making decisions and using procedures that are unfamiliar to many of us. But as the next picture shows, that's where this guide comes in. Its purpose is to make navigating this forest less scary and more achievable by providing a basic path to follow and some practical tools and resources. This path still might require some effort to traverse, and it might take you in different ways depending on your specific situation, but the data sharing guide provides guideposts along the way. Next, we'll look at what the guide addresses. To identify what the guide should address, we talked with a set of IES research grantees about the challenges they had faced or were aware of other researchers facing in preparing data sets for sharing. And based on these interviews and also discussions with IES research commissioners, we focused the guide on 3 major topics. First, disclosure risk analysis and mitigation. That is assessing the risk of identifying individuals or entities who were promised confidentiality and taking steps to mitigate that risk. The second is data set documentation, and the third is depositing the data set. We call these the 3 Ds of sharing data. While issues around disclosure risk analysis and mitigation, the first topic, really set the stage for other decisions about how and where to share the data, all of these issues are intertwined so that decisions about one issue can affect how another issue needs to be handled. When we look at the section on disclosure risk analysis and mitigation, the guide addresses researchers' authorization to share their data, including the content of consent forms and memoranda of understanding with education agencies. In this first section, and also throughout the guide, we provide resources and suggestions that researchers can use at different stages in their projects. So we have suggestions and ideas and resources for researchers who are just getting started with their studies. And we also provide ideas for what they can do if they haven't really thought about data sharing, or at least not thought about it very much until the middle or the end of the project. All is not lost. There are ways to share data even if you begin at that point in the project, which we hope you won't do. But even if that's the case, there's still things you can do. This section also includes a step-by-step guide to conducting a disclosure risk analysis and describes options and resources for mitigating that risk. Some of these options are restricting access to data and making changes to the data, whether they might be simple or complex, like data swapping or perturbing. For the complex approaches like data swapping or perturbing, we provide links to papers and software that explore these approaches in depth. The next section on documenting the data set is extremely practical. The guide describes how to begin documenting the data set from the beginning of a study so that you're not scrambling at the end, and includes a tool for recording decisions and activities related to the study in an ongoing way. Of course, ongoing documentation also makes your own work more efficient, so there's a win-win. We also address data file organization. We provide an example of well-organized, annotated code to include in the documentation. And we also include excerpts from a description of data files document, which is a comprehensive document that explains how the data were collected and how the data files are organized in the data set. In some cases, when data owners aren't willing to allow their data to be shared, the researcher can only provide code or a description of the files that were used, and the guide addresses that too. The final section about depositing the data describes various considerations in choosing data repositories. And some of these considerations are the cost of depositing the data, the types of data that are accepted, any assistance that the repository can provide for curating your data, that is preparing it to be shared, any limits on the file size they might have, likelihood of the data being discovered by other researchers, which is an important consideration, the length of deposit, and any independent certifications of the repository's trustworthiness. A summary is included of repositories that are likely to be of greatest interest to education researchers. And we discuss, though we don't recommend, alternatives to repositories such as university or personal websites. So the guide provides both tools, moving to the next slide, and ways of thinking about data sharing and working through challenges. It provides perspective, if you will. So both tools and perspective. So let's talk about some of these tools. I've already mentioned some of them, but just to reiterate, the guide includes very practical materials and links to resources. There are checklists for each section with detailed questions to ask yourself about things like the authorizations you have to share data or the content of the data documentation. Throughout the guide in each section, we also include models, templates, and examples. So really all kinds of different materials to help you get a good idea of how to go about doing something and what a good model is of a completed element of your data set. Moving on, while there are specific tools, examples, models, and checklists in the guide, we also include broader perspectives or guiding principles on how to think about data sharing. So one perspective that's important to remember is that there is no single approach to data sharing that will work for every study. You know, we can learn from choices that colleagues have made, but there are unique features of our own studies that might mean that we need to implement a slightly different approach. So that's why the guide includes specific actions that researchers can take to just get a handle on your degrees of freedom, like, steps to assess disclosure risks in your data set. We also provide examples of education researchers who have taken different approaches to data sharing, sometimes coming up with very creative solutions in the midst of difficult situations. And we hope that these examples can spark some ideas about options that might work for you. In fact, you might even know some of these researchers. A second perspective is that the goal of data sharing is to produce something that is genuinely valuable for the advancement of knowledge and the improvement of education. The goals of open data to support reproducibility of results and extensions of the original study can only be accomplished when a data set is made available with high quality and care, and located where other investigators can find it. So keeping that end goal in mind is really important throughout that whole process. The third perspective is that trade-offs might be necessary. As we look at the next slide, and each researcher needs to think through those trade-offs for their own study, keeping in mind the goal, as I just mentioned, of producing something valuable for science and education improvement. So, with data sharing, competing goods may really be in tension, such as the completeness and usefulness of a data set on the one hand, and disclosure risk mitigation on the other. When those goods are out of balance, researchers might produce a data set that is freely available for anyone to access, but it has so much data deleted or coarsened that it's not of any real use for additional investigation. Or they might produce a data set that retains all of the original detail, but has many restrictions on who can use it. There's no formula to be applied. Researchers just need to think through the trade-offs for their own study by looking at the options that they have with their own data. A final perspective encourages researchers not to give up if they encounter roadblocks, but instead to think about what they can share. Data sharing can be genuinely difficult in education because of the patchwork of data owners that we have in some studies, and also data disclosure concerns. There is some information in education studies that is truly sensitive. But if you can't put data in a repository for some reason, perhaps because a data owner just won't allow you to, perhaps you can share some code and describe the data well so that someone else can try to obtain those files and extend your analysis. If you can't share all of the data, you can share as much of it as you can that is likely to be useful for another researcher. So in sum, as we look at the last slide, the goal of this guide is really to help researchers do what they can to provide data to another researcher. And then just to return to the forest metaphor that we started with, whether that's providing the equivalent of a well-supplied backpack, that's always the ideal, or just a map that provides clear directions. Maybe that's some code and a description of data files, or even just some breadcrumbs for them to follow. I'm looking forward to talking with you and hearing your questions. And if you have additional questions and want to reach out to me directly, this is where I can be reached at this email address.
My name is Beth Tipton, and my co-author Rob Olson and I will be talking about the Evaluator's Guide to Generalizability that we developed for IES. This guide is intended for researchers who conduct impact evaluations of educational interventions and funders of those evaluations. It is motivated by the demand for rigorous evidence from consumers of research like local, state, and federal education policymakers. As a result, the guide encourages researchers to take a population perspective when designing, analyzing, and reporting findings from impact studies. The guide includes 7 recommendations that are applicable to both prospective impact evaluations that need to recruit sites and retrospective experimental and quasi-experimental studies based on extant data. We intend for the guide to be useful to both studies funded by grants and those funded by contracts. Let's begin. The overall goal of the guide is to help researchers conducting impact evaluations to produce evidence that informs educational and policy decisions. This includes how to design a study, how to recruit a sample, how to assess generalizability, and how to incorporate generalizability into analyses and reporting. Throughout the guide, we include a running example to illustrate our recommendations in these areas. We also point to 2 software programs that can be useful. One is the Generalizer, which is a free web tool. The other is a new R package called Generalize. The guide also includes more advanced methods at the end for advanced users. Rob, take it away.
Thank you, Beth. The first section of the guide covers recommendations for the design phase of an impact study. In designing a study, the guide recommends first, defining the target population, second, developing a population frame, and third, designing a sampling plan. Defining the primary target population establishes the set of students and schools about which the evaluation hopes to learn. The guide recommends identifying potential impact moderators, specifically the student and school characteristics that may moderate the effect of the intervention, and then using them to define the study's target population. This will focus the study team on estimating the average impact of the intervention across that set of students and schools. Developing a population frame has two main purposes. The first is to identify the list of eligible schools that could be included in the study. The second is to assemble data on potential impact moderators for those schools. These moderators play an important role in many of the remaining recommendations, including the next one on developing a sampling plan. The guide identifies useful resources for building a population frame. These resources include available data sets that researchers can draw from, and a tool, which Beth mentioned, called the Generalizer, which, among other things, pulls data from a few of these data sets. Developing a sampling plan is key to obtaining a sample that is as representative of the target population as possible. The guide describes both balanced sampling approaches and probability sampling approaches to obtaining a representative sample. And both of these methods involve selection of schools within strata with replacement of schools that decline to participate. The guide also covers two-stage sampling of districts and schools, which is particularly useful for large impact studies with large national target populations. Next slide, please. This table from the guide identifies some of the data sources that researchers can use in developing population frames for impact studies conducted in schools. For studies conducted in public schools, the Common Core of Data, or CCD, will typically be the right starting point. But other data sets, including those shown here, contain information that may be helpful in either restricting the population frame to schools that are eligible or in providing additional data on potential impact moderators that are not available in the CCD. Next slide, please. As noted earlier, the sampling approaches described in the guide all involve stratification. Stratification involves dividing the schools in the population frame into groups called strata based on the potential impact moderators and specifying the number of schools to include in the sample from each stratum. The guide suggests a specific approach to stratification that uses cluster analysis, and it provides guidance on the number of strata to create. Once schools are divided into strata, the data in the population frame can be used to describe the characteristics of the schools in each stratum, as illustrated in the example shown on this slide. Next slide, please. Building on the example in the previous table, this slide shows the number of target schools in each stratum for this particular example. These targets are designed to ensure that in each stratum, the percentage of schools in the sample matches the percent of schools in the population frame. So in this example, 285 out of 4,149 schools in the population frame come from stratum 1, or 7% of all schools in the population frame. This suggests that 7% of schools in the sample, or 3 of the 40 schools to be included, should come from stratum 1. Next slide, please, and passing it back to Beth.
The next part of the guide focuses on how to implement generalizability practices into a study. The guide covers how to recruit schools in accordance with the sampling plan. The guide offers advice on resource allocation and staff training, data collection from recruited schools, and progress monitoring towards meeting school recruitment targets in each stratum, as well as adjustments to recruitment to ensure that those targets are met. Progress monitoring is particularly important because school recruitment may occur over many months. Recruitment in some strata may lag behind, and study teams can ramp up recruitment in those strata to improve the representativeness of the final sample. The guide also covers how to assess the generalizability of the sample. That is, how similar the schools that were in this that are successfully recruited into the study are to the target population. This includes comparing schools on potential moderators, as well as considering the effects that there might be of unobserved moderators. For potential moderators, researchers should use at least the variables assembled in the population frame for sampling, and you're encouraged to construct a generalizability index, which is described in the guide. On the next slide, we provide an example of the kind of recruitment list that the generalizer provides and that we show in the guide. This is only showing 5 rows, but the generalizer typically provides a list of all of the schools that are eligible to be in a study in each stratum. The generalizer also includes these columns to the right. So you'll notice these columns include places to collect information on study eligibility, on if schools agree to participate, and importantly, if they don't participate, why they don't participate. Next slide. Continuing in this example throughout the guide, we also illustrate how the data collected using that spreadsheet can help you with your generalizability analyses. So this example focuses on a study evaluating the impact of a hypothetical reading intervention. The impact of the intervention is expected to vary depending on the school's existing reading curriculum, but data on reading curricula are not available in any population frame. So the study team in this example selects and recruits a representative sample of 110 schools, of which 40 agree to participate and 70 decline. But they're also able during that recruitment process to ask, what is your current reading program? So the table compares 40 volunteer schools and the 70 declining schools on their existing reading program and finds substantial differences. So in the example, we discuss how these differences may raise concerns about the impact found in the 40 schools and how well it might generalize to other schools that are not part of the target population or that did not agree to be in the study. Next slide. The guide also provides information on how to create tables and data comparisons that can be helpful. So studies should also compare the sample and population on variables included in the frame. And here's a table illustrating one of these that we've taken from the example. So again, the example uses data from the Common Core of data. And what we're showing here is that schools with high proportions of Black students are somewhat overrepresented in the sample, whereas those with high proportions of Hispanic students are somewhat underrepresented. And so this means that there may be some adjustments that are necessary in the analysis in order for the sample to be truly representative of the population. Rob, you can take it from here to talk about analysis and reporting.
Great, thanks, Beth. So the last section of the guide covers recommendations related to analysis and reporting. In terms of analysis, the guide recommends that impact studies statistically adjust for differences between the sample and the population. It also indicates when these adjustments are necessary, when simple post-stratification adjustments are sufficient, and when more sophisticated methods such as propensity score methods are needed. It also provides some guidance to advanced users of these more advanced methods, such as propensity score methods, with references to other work for more details. In terms of reporting, the guide provides specific recommendations on information that impact studies should report to help readers assess the generalizability of the study to the primary target population, as well as information that could help readers assess the generalizability to other target populations. Next slide, please. This table from the guide provides an example of how to statistically adjust for differences between the schools that agree to participate in the study and the full population from which they were selected and recruited. In this particular example, the study team was unable to recruit as many schools as they had aimed to recruit from Stratum 2 and from Stratum 5. As a result, schools from these strata are underrepresented in the sample. The calculation shown here demonstrates how post-stratification can be used to upweight the schools in those strata by assigning them a normalized weight that is greater than 1. This ensures that the weighted share of schools in the sample matches the share of schools in the population for each stratum. These weights would then be used when running regression models to estimate the population average treatment effect. Next slide, and back to Beth.
Finally, this slide shows an excerpt of a longer table that we provide in the guide in Recommendation 7, which is reporting guidelines. So in this section, we provide a list of each of the 7 recommendations on the left. You're only seeing 3 of these right now. And on the right, we provide a list of information that impact studies should collect and report to help readers assess the generalizability of study findings. We also include example text for how to incorporate generalizability into different parts of manuscripts and reports. This includes text in, for the example in an abstract, in an introduction, the method section, results, and illustrates that you don't need to be, doesn't need to be very long in order to provide some information that can help readers. Final slide. To wrap up, this has been a brief overview and may seem like a lot. We'd like to emphasize that this guide is written for a broad audience of researchers, and while it includes some technical details for advanced users, in general, it's not very technical in nature. We urge researchers to remember that questions of generalizability are inherent in discussions of impact findings. And to this end, we think that this will be helpful for studies funded by both grants and those funded by contracts. If you would like more information or would like to discuss generalizability, feel free to reach out to either of us, and our information is provided here. Thanks.
Imagine you're reading a report on findings from an impact evaluation. You see an impact estimate that looks pretty good. It looks like the intervention had a favorable effect. But you have to wonder, what are the chances that favorable estimate is due to a genuine effect as opposed to random error? That's a pretty important question, and it seems like it's one that's pretty basic for an evaluator to answer if asked by a funder or a decision maker. We used to use p-values and statistical significance to try to answer this question, but in 2016, the American Statistical Association released a statement on the widespread misinterpretation of p-values and statistical significance. Essentially, the ASA said, you actually can't use p-values or significant stars to answer that important question of what's the probability this thing worked. But they didn't say that we are wrong to want to know the probability that the intervention worked. And in fact, my colleague Mariel and I feel pretty strongly, as do I suspect most evaluators, that this is a really important question to answer. We need to understand the probability that an intervention worked, given the research evidence. So to meet that need, we developed a framework for interpreting impact estimates from evaluations that we call BASIE, which stands for Bayesian Interpretation of Estimates. And today we're going to be describing a guide, a practical guide for education researchers who would like to implement this approach. So this guide is written for multiple audiences. We offer an express train through this guide, if you will, moving quickly from basic concepts to calculating that critical probability that the intervention worked. But we also allow you to hop off the express onto one of many local stops to explore concepts and technical details in more depth. For people writing the express, we provide a simple to use spreadsheet tool that you can download to calculate probabilities of interest. The tool includes everything you need to get going right away. But we also provide R and STAN programs for readers interested in conducting more complex analyses, such as developing your own custom prior distributions. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Mariel to walk us through a motivational example.
So in this important example, we want you to imagine that you are evaluating an intervention called Crank It Out. And in this table, we show your findings. We have 2 different outcomes, math and reading, and the first 2 columns show the impact estimate and the standard error. So if you were to evaluate this intervention using the standard null hypothesis significance testing framework, then you would interpret these findings in the first 2 columns using the p-values shown in the last column. And what Homer, John's very cute dog here, is incredibly sad about is that because you've decided to use p-values, you found yourself in this unfortunate situation where you're very close to having a finding that you can talk about, but unfortunately it's not statistically significant. So really your hands are tied. You can't really say anything at all, even though the implementation of the intervention was good. So I'm going to move to the next slide, and I'm going to show what would happen if, instead of using p-values, we instead interpreted these exact same findings using this BASIE framework. Okay, in this table, we have the same impact estimates and the same standard errors, but the last 4 columns are new. And they are our answer to that fundamental question that John asked right up front. What is the probability that this intervention we're evaluating had a genuine effect on outcomes? So if you look at the rightmost column as an example, it's telling us the probability that the intervention improved test scores by at least 0.1 standard deviations. And with these posterior probabilities, these Bayesian probabilities in hand, we're able to tell a more nuanced and a more complete story about the effects of this intervention. And look how happy that has made Homer. He's psyched. Specifically, you can see that we're estimating here a 95% probability that Crank It Out improves math test scores. Just to be super clear, I calculated that 95% chance of a favorable effect by taking 100% and then subtracting off the 5% chance of an unfavorable effect that's shown in the middle top cell. If you move 1 cell to the right, you see that we're estimating here an 87% chance that the program improved math test scores by at least 0.05 standard deviations. And then if you move down to the bottom row, you can see that there's even a 79% chance that reading test scores were improved. Though we do see in the bottom right cell that any effect was more likely than not on the smaller side. So the key takeaway from this example here is that, as we saw on the previous slide, when we use this kind of thumbs up, thumbs down framework of statistical significance testing, we can end up in a thumbs down situation like the one that we have in this example. And here, John and I really feel like thumbs down is frankly the wrong conclusion to come to, right? Because given what we see on this slide, we now know that there is actually quite a high probability that the intervention improved outcomes, and there's a good probability that it had a meaningfully large effect on those outcomes in math. So that's our motivational example. I hope you're good and motivated to use BASIE. And now we're going to turn to the kind of more practical question of what specific steps we need in order to calculate the probabilities shown on this slide. There are 4 such steps. And in the guide, we provide really detailed guidance about implementing each one. Today, we're just going to hit each one quickly at a high level, starting with perhaps the most important step. John's going to talk about how to select the prior distribution.
Thanks, Mariel. So thinking back to the cover slide, and when we were talking about interpreting that impact estimate, we wanted to figure out what's the probability that there is a genuine effect given that impact estimate. In order to know that, in order to calculate that, we need to know how common it is for education interventions to have meaningful effects. It kind of makes sense. If you want to know the probability that you had a meaningful effect, you need to know that how often that happens. And that's what a prior distribution is. In this guide, we have prepared a large number of prior distributions that you can use, and they're included in the spreadsheet tool. We've used Bayesian meta-regression analysis to analyze past findings from the What Works Clearinghouse database, focusing only on findings from studies that met standards, to calculate this distribution of intervention effects. We have distributions that vary across outcome domains, they vary across school levels, and we have some modeling methodological choices that you can assess sensitivity to. Let's go to the next slide. Here I have for you an example of what a prior distribution based on this analysis looks like. In this particular case, we're calculating the prior distribution using all intervention effects in the What Works Clearinghouse that met standards. And you can see that it's more common to have a positive effect than a negative effect, but all effects, most effects, tend to be small. The median effect in this prior distribution is 0.11 standard deviations, and the mean is 0.16 standard deviations. Let's go to the next slide. In the guide, we provide guidance for how to select a prior distribution. We also provide some guidance in the local stops for how you could synthesize your own prior distribution using a meta-regression approach similar to ours. And we provide some conceptual guidance about things to keep in mind when you're doing that. For example, we emphasize that it is better to start with a broad array of evidence and narrow your focus only in a specific way using meta-regression techniques, which we describe in the guide. All right, so now I'm going to turn it back to Mariel to talk about next steps.
Great. Step number 2 is choosing which point estimate of the impact to report. And there are 2 options here. You could report the traditional impact estimate, the one we've always used, that's based just on study data alone. Or now that you're in this Bayesian framework, you have another option, which is to present what's called the shrunken impact estimate. And that shrinks your study data impact, your traditional impact, towards the prior mean. Jan and I recommend reporting both of these. They both have an important role to play. And really the decision boils down to which one you should emphasize, which one you should report in your abstract, for example. And we discuss the decision around where to place the emphasis more in the guide. It depends on the context in your study. Step 3 is interpreting that impact estimate. And this is really at the core, at the heart of BASIE. Remember that the I in BASIE stands for interpret. This is where we really come in with our strongest recommendation, and that is to use Bayesian posterior probabilities instead of p-values to interpret your findings. We've told you how it's going to give you this nice, nuanced, kind of full story about your intervention's effect. We do acknowledge, however, that all of that new nuance and complexity can be a bit of a double-edged sword. And in some contexts, you really might need to choose some cutoffs. Some probability cutoffs that you're going to use to decide when to draw attention to a particular finding. So to be specific, as an example, you might want to choose, would we highlight an effect as kind of highly likely if it had, say, at least a 90% chance of improving outcomes by at least 0.05 standard deviations, those kinds of cutoffs. And we recommend making those decisions a priori, pre-registering them. And we recommend doing so in a really careful and context-dependent way after really thinking through the costs and benefits of your intervention in your setting. What do those interpretive statements look like? We've shown them to you in a table, and here's how they might look in text. They can be quite brief. For example, we could say nice and succinctly in plain language that we estimate a 75% probability that the intervention increased test scores by at least 0.15 standard deviations. We are aware that there could be a temptation to misinterpret that kind of very brief statement. In particular, when we use probabilities kind of in casual conversation, we're often referring to predictions. We're talking, for example, about the probability that our sports team is going to win tonight, or the probability that it's going to rain tomorrow. And one thing we really want to be careful about is guarding against misinterpretation of these probability statements. We want to be very clear that they are not predictions about future effects. And we know that this is a risk because, as Beth and Rob were just telling us, these kinds of predictions and generalizations are really of high substantive interest. But we want to be very clear that is not what we're doing here. We want to make sure that everyone explains really clearly to their readers that the probabilities we report using BASIE are retrospective statements about the effect of the intervention in the context where it was evaluated. Another thing we want to be careful about is that the readers of your reports and your manuscripts really understand that these probability statements must be interpreted relative to the selected prior distribution that you chose way back in step 1. So in this case, these probability statements are meant to be interpreted relative to the prior evidence on impacts of reading programs for elementary school students. So we really want to bake that prior choice into this statement at the bottom of the slide, this more complete statement. Back to you for the last step, John.
Sure, thanks, Mariel. So in calculating this key probability, the probability that the intervention had a favorable effect, a meaningful effect, given the prior evidence, the choice of that prior distribution is really important. We can't calculate this probability without the prior, so it can matter which prior distribution we use. In the interest of transparency, so that people really understand where these numbers are coming from and how sensitive they are to assumptions, we strongly recommend that researchers conduct sensitivity analyses to see how critical interpretive statements would change if you used a different prior distribution. We provide recommendations in the guide for how to conduct these sensitivity analyses, for default sensitivity analyses we think everybody should do, and some guidance about modeling choices and what they mean and how to interpret the sensitivity analyses. One thing that's really, I think, comforting to know, and I hope it's comforting for you, is that the bigger your study, the smaller your standard error, the lower the sensitivity to your choice of prior. So if you want to have less sensitivity to a prior distribution, you can take that into account when you're powering your study. And you can use our spreadsheet tool as a way to assess that sensitivity at the design stage of a study. So that's the guide. That's our preview of the guide. We can go to the last slide. Our goal with this guide is to help researchers in the education field overcome this conundrum that we've been facing since the ASA statement came out. We need to be able to assess the probability that an intervention had meaningful effects given the results of our study. We can't do it with p-values, and we need a different way forward. So we're proposing this approach, Bayesian interpretation of estimates, based on evidence-based priors as a solution to that quandary. And we hope this guide can help those interested in using this approach to use it in their work. And if you have any questions about the guide, or if you just want to talk about Bayesian methods in general, or bloodhounds, you can reach out to Mariel and I at these email addresses. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us for the live Q&A session. I think since there's quite a few people here, we can maybe begin with chat. If people have questions, they want to just throw it in the chat and we can start taking questions in order. I'm certainly happy as the moderator, as prerogative, to maybe just start us off, a little icebreaker for the panel here. One question I just wanted to start with was with regard to the BASIE topic. And in particular, I was wondering, because as you do studies, it's not just the final average impact that you're often reporting, especially these days. And in fact, as part of the process of getting to that outcome, you often have to do a lot of other statistical tests and calculations to get there. For example, in a regression discontinuity design, you need to sometimes do a McCrary test. Even sort of basic things like baseline equivalence tests, you have to do inference to get to those answers. So to what extent should BASIE also be applied to all those intermediate types of analyses? And does it raise questions about, okay, what thresholds should be used in those cases? How do we think about priors in those cases? Because maybe there's not as intuitive an analog in that sense. So I'll just kind of throw that question out there and see what folks think.
Well, I could take a first stab at that, and Mariel, if you want to jump in after my first stab. All right, sounds good. So Tom, that's a really great question. I think it would be useful for me to first just clarify what BASIE, as it's presented in the guide, is targeted on doing, and then sort of compare and contrast that with the question you're asking. So the thing that BASIE is really focused on, especially as presented in the guide, where we have a spreadsheet tool that makes this accessible to folks, it's really focused on interpreting the main impact estimate out of an evaluation. And so for that purpose, that's what the guide and the spreadsheet tool is really focused on. Abstracting beyond that, there are a lot of other estimates that we pay attention to beyond that main impact estimate for your full sample. And you gave some great examples, like a McCrary regression discontinuity design. Thinking about that from like a Bayesian perspective more broadly, not just the guide, but more broadly, it really is the case that for any situation where you would traditionally use a p-value or a statistical test, there could be a lot of value added to taking a Bayesian approach. And for example, with the McCrary test, where you're looking for discontinuities in the density of an assignment variable around a cutoff, it's not really the case that there either is or is not a discontinuity in the density of the assignment variable, which is kind of how the hypothesis testing thing is set up. It's more that there's some degree of a difference, and to what extent does the degree of that difference affect your inference? You know, that's really the issue. And so I think that if you were to take a Bayesian approach in that situation, it would be an improvement, but that goes beyond what BASIE can do or what BASIE is set up to do in the guide. So I think I'll pause there and see if Mariel has anything to add to it.
Nothing for me. That sounds great. Thanks for the question, Tom.
Thanks a lot. So let's just jump right into the chat because we have a few questions. So Fiona Hollins asks about the data guide, Ruth. I'm not sure if you saw that, but basically the question is, has anyone tried to replicate studies from data that have undergone small cell suppression, data swapping, perturbing, etc., and with what success? So Ruth, do you want to jump in on that? Any thoughts? I think you're muted, Ruth.
Oh,
I think you're still muted, or you muted and then unmuted, or
it keeps muting me, Tom. I don't know what's going on. Okay, okay. Just wave if I become muted again. So for the third time, Fiona, that was an awesome question. So, you know, I think one of the things that we encourage people to do as they're thinking about what the options are for them with their data sets is to actually try small cell suppression if that's of interest to them, data swapping and perturbing, and to see whether they can basically reproduce or closely reproduce the estimates from their study. And that's a consideration as you're just trying to decide which direction to go, is whether you can actually reproduce that study using those approaches. One of the links in the guide is to a piece of software, which is relatively new, that allows people to try out those different approaches. So, you know, I think it should be easier for the individual, like original investigator, to do that. In terms of whether there are other studies that have done that and reported on it, I don't know of any. I almost want to ask Tom, who I know has served on like the disclosure review board for NCES with regard to NCE data sets. I know we used to do small cell suppression, and I honestly don't remember what kinds of assessments were done to see whether, you know, how much the original findings could be reproduced. I don't know if that's something you can answer, Tom.
Yeah, I don't think I'm not familiar with you know, certainly that anything that IES has done on that, but certainly it's a good sort of strand of inquiry, especially as there's more data sharing going on. We really want to understand what is the potential impact of some of these data disclosure treatments, so to speak. So I think it is a potential strand moving forward. So thanks for the question. Norma Ming asked a question, will there also be guides written for the perspective of education agencies? I mean, I think that's a great question. I would just say, Norma, that right now we obviously haven't done that directly, in part because SEER is still relatively new in terms of what's been specified. And really, these standards have been specified for education researchers and what they do. And so as a first step in this whole process of moving the field, we think that the guides initially make most sense to target education researchers and their practice. But it's a great point that eventually, as we move down the pipeline, we need to be able to communicate sort of this new way, new approaches of doing research to education agencies, other stakeholders that are interested in our work. So certainly something for the future. The next question, which I think comes from quite a few people actually who seconded this, is first started with by Allison, and it has to do with the question about priors. Okay, so a lot of areas where we don't necessarily have strong priors, what do we do in that case? And so I think there's at least a couple more people, including Becca Maynard, also raised that question. So John, Mariel, do you want to jump in on that with some thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I can take a first stab and then I'm sure John will fill in the blanks. Thanks for the question. It's such an important one. We get it every single time we talk about this. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to tell you our thoughts. Our big picture guidance is that if in your narrow context, there's no prior evidence available, you should try to situate that context into some broader population of evidence. So the bottom line guidance is go broad. And John, I'm just going to steal your wonderful wording on this. John sometimes says, like, if nothing else, your intervention is likely to be an example of a federally funded intervention that seeks to move the needle on public well-being. So you can go really quite broad, I think, when looking for a prior. And that's a reasonable thing to do because improving public well-being is a really hard thing to do, meaning that when we evaluate these interventions, we tend to see pretty small effects. And that's really true across a very wide variety of interventions. So going broad makes sense because these seemingly less related interventions actually are quite related in terms of the magnitudes of effects that we can expect to see.
I agree with that, of course. And I would just add to it that another piece of general advice that we like to give is that we don't want to make the infeasible perfect the enemy of the feasible good, because if we do that, then the worst can win. And so in this case, the worst would be to misinterpret a p-value and to use that as your approach to trying to figure out the probability something worked. The feasible good is to put your impact estimate in the context of the evidence that we actually have. And so that evidence may not be the ideal evidence, it may not be what you wish you had, but it's what we have. It's the evidence that we have regarding the distribution of effects from interventions that people implement in the real world where they're trying to improve outcomes. And all of the interventions we're studying fits within that population. So yeah, I agree with what Mariel said, and don't make the perfect the enemy of what we can actually do.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, and so just a few other quick questions. We only have time for maybe one or two more. One question: what is a good book or article you would recommend for those who would like to learn more about Bayesian methods and interpretation of estimates? Glad there's a lot of excitement there. I would say certainly this guide that we're going to be releasing in the coming months would be a great starting point, but I don't know if John or Mariel, you have other suggestions. I'm not sure if they're saying something more technical or just something more on a sort of conceptual level, but any sort of quick thoughts?
Yeah, so I think on the more practical level, our guide really would be a great place to start. It's really targeted towards this application area specifically. I think if you're wanting a broader introduction to Bayesian methods, the kind of Bible is called Bayesian Data Analysis. It's in its 3rd edition now. It's by Andrew Gelman. He's at Columbia, and he's really the preeminent Bayesian thinker of our generation, I think. Also, it's free. The PDF is free online. He's a big believer in making everything open source. There's great code examples. I slept with it underneath my pillow the night before my dissertation defense. I recommend it highly.
Yeah, and you know, there are a variety of other sources that you'll find online, and there are some cool examples of how Bayes has been applied in different contexts. People use Bayesian methods to find like lost submarines during the Cold War and all sorts of exciting things like that. But there are some like, sort of different philosophical debates that go on around Bayesian methods. And so within that realm, I would also recommend paying particular attention to Andrew Gelman's work, because he's really thought carefully, I think, about how to use Bayesian methods in a context where we want to be evidence-based and striving for as much objectivity as we can achieve. So I double that recommendation.
Thanks, John. One question from Winetta about, are the training sessions scheduled? How do we sign up for them? That's a great question. They're not scheduled yet, but I think we will obviously, once we have lined up exactly what events we'll be doing in relation to these guides when they come out, we will be sure to blast them out. We'll have a strategy for trying to reach out to our audience to make sure that you're aware of the options available to you and give you an opportunity to sign up. So thanks for following up on that. So we're basically out of time. I saw that there are a few questions related to Beth and Rob's guide on generalizability. Appreciate that in the chat. Beth and Rob did provide some responses to that. I think there are a few more that we didn't quite get to. If some of the authors want to stay for a few seconds just to maybe type a quick response in the chat, that would be really great. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks so much for your time. Hope this was helpful, and enjoy the rest of the conference.